And I'm getting to the part now that is the most important for me to tell you, and the part that I will never understand. I do understand why it happened, but they were building a building in the middle of Sheffield Park. And it's the concession stand that you see now in the middle of Sheffield Park. And I hadn't really paid attention to it because there wasn't much there. I noticed they've been doing some repairs or whatever. And James Finch gave me a phone call. And he said, Margo, can you find out from me who's the contractor on the building in Sheffield Park? Because James had the contract at Porter Park, building the restrooms there, and he wanted to find out some things about the building, about the design of it, who was building it. James does not like to build buildings. He does paving and all that, but he wanted to know who was doing it. He wanted the design, and he just wanted to know who was building it. They portrayed it in the court that James was mad because he didn't get the contract to build the building. That was not it at all. He just wanted the specs on the building. He wanted to know how they were, if they were air conditioning the bathrooms, that kind of thing. But he wanted to know who was building it because he had gone down to the building, and who did he find there but Mickey White, who was the owner of Erosion Control Services,
the brand new company.
Yeah, the brand new company that got the $5 million from Lynn Haven. And so he told me, he said, Mickey does not have a contractor's license. He said, can you find out who's the contractor, or who did the bids on the building? So I go over to the city office where Vicki Gaynor is as the interim manager. She's only been there a few days, about probably a week and a half at that point. And I said, Vicki, who bid on the building in Sheffield Park, and who's building it? Do you know? And she said to me just that quickly, there were no bids. I said, oh. And I said, well, who's the builder? And she said, ECS. I said, oh. I said, well, do you have like a file or anything on ECS? And she said, just a minute. And she called, and she comes back with this file. There was one sheet of paper in the file that Vicki handed to me. And I looked at the piece of paper, and at the top of it, it had the concession stand, and it sort of had some line items, and it was $180,000 and some change for that little concession stand. And I was like, wow, $180,000, almost $200,000. So that kind of struck me as odd. But then I looked a little further down on the page, and it was an Excel sheet, and there were 5 checks listed. Excuse me, there may have been 6 checks, I believe, I'm sorry. And each check had a check number and an amount, and then there was a blank space that said purchase order number and another space that said invoice. All the spaces were blank except for the amounts of the checks and the check number. And one of the checks was for over $1 million. And one of them was over $700,000. And my eyes were getting bigger, and I was trying to keep a straight face as I was looking at it. And I said, thank you very much. And I got in my car, and I drove it as fast as I could over to James's office. And so this might be a good time to point out to anybody in the room who doesn't know that we have been very good friends for decades. That came out in the news, but we've been very good friends for decades. And so has my husband of 27 years, has also been good friends with James Finch for decades. We were separately good friends with him until 1996 when Lee and I met, and then our friendship, sort of meshed, and we'll talk about that more. But James, as most of you know, knows a lot about construction. He knows a lot about buildings, and I trusted him, and I still trust him. One of the few people I do trust. And I took this piece of paper to his office, and I went in and I said, well, I found out about the concession stand, but I found out something else too. I said, look at this, and please tell me that something's not wrong. And he nearly tipped his chair over. So the first thing that I see him do is he kicks his chair around, and he pulls out his flip phone, which is what he has. And he was talking to Derwin White on the phone. And I'm thinking, why is he calling Derwin White? Well, I didn't know that Mickey was Derwin's nephew. James did know that. I didn't know that. And so in just 5 minutes, Derwin White is in the office, and he comes in, and he's surprised to see me sitting there, and we're sitting in James's office. And the conversation, I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty accurate. I wrote it down in the book when I started writing the book, and it's probably more accurate in the book. But James just kind of threw the paper over to Derwin, and Derwin looked at it. And people say, oh, well, you're blaming a dead man. Do you know how bad I wish Derwin White was alive and sitting right there so I could take my fist and just punch him between the eyes? That's what I wish. But I wouldn't do that, but that's how I feel sometimes. But Derwin White looked at that and he went, wow. And he did that. You know how you do that sheepish laugh? That's a lot of money, you know. And James said, yeah, somebody's stealing from the city of Lynn Haven. That's exactly what he said. And long pause, and Derwin's still kind of laughing. His face is getting that red, flushed look, the laugh. And I'm just watching this exchange between James and Derwin. And James repeated again. He said, somebody's stealing from Lynn Haven. And Derwin sort of started backing up. He said, that's a lot of money. And he said, and the mayor has found this, and she's going to the sheriff. Well, we hadn't discussed that I was going to the sheriff yet. He just said that. But it hit me that I've got to go to the sheriff. You know, to be an elected official or a county official, to know of fraud and to know of crime and to not report it for whatever reason, that James had already said what I was going to have to do. I'm going to have to go to the sheriff. So I'm sitting there thinking, oh, I've got to go to the sheriff, you know. And Derwin got very angry. He told James, you know, we don't need to do that. He said, I can handle this. We don't need to involve the sheriff with this. And James immediately pointed out there's no we to it. There's no we here, you know. And Derwin said, y'all don't need to, and he yelled out basically a threat. I don't remember the exact words, but he was mad and he yelled out a threat and he went out the door. And James walked over to the window and was looking out into the parking lot, and I was sitting in a chair like I am now, and he said, did you see who was in the truck with Derwin? And I said, no, I can't see. He said it was Michael White. So let that sink in. So that brings us to April 1st, which, again, the dates of this, you can't make it up, you know, but it was a Monday morning. And so what I did, I went to the person that I trusted in Lynn Haven, we had been through so much through the storm. They had made me feel a part of things. And I do need to point out that I'll call it the old, there's a lot of good people who work for Lynn Haven, a lot of good people, but there's an old guard at Lynn Haven that's been there a long time. Some of them are still there right now. And I'm backtracking, but when I ran for mayor in 2015, on part of my campaign strategy, one of the things that I promised was to fix stormwater, the flooding, because the things that I had been complaining about was that they never mowed the ditches, they never cleaned out the culverts. And then with some looking and some researching, we found they were transferring over $1 million a year from enterprise funds, the stormwater, into general fund to pay 10 salaries of $1.2 million. And 10 of those salaries were married to each other. Okay. The police chief at the time and his wife, neither with more than a high school diploma. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I'm just saying, in a town where the average income in 2015 was less than $26,000, the two of them were knocking down $250,000 a year with benefits. Well, I published all that in a brochure, and I won the mayor by 64%.
In 2015.
In 2015. But what I also won was a circle of enemies down there, a circle of enemies. And that's going to come back, and you're going to see how they testified and the interviews they gave to the FBI, to the sheriff's department when they had that opportunity. But back to where we were.
April 1st.
April 1st. And so I take my little sheet of paper with the $4.6 million. One of those checks, by the way, was deposited on New Year's Eve. You know, and I went to Ricky Ramey and I said, Ricky, I don't want to really tell you about what it is yet, but I found some financial discrepancies in Lynn Haven and I don't know who to talk to about it. And I said, I'm going to the sheriff and I'd like for you to go with me as a witness. What I didn't know is Ricky already knew about it. He already knew about it. Okay.
How do you think he knew?
Well, I didn't know he knew then.
Right.
You know, I know he knew now.
Yeah.
But Ricky was like, "Yep, I'll be glad to go with you. In fact, I'll even call the sheriff for you and make the appointment." And that's what he did for noon. And so he told me he'd meet me there. So I drive down to the sheriff's office and I go in the front door and tell him I'm there to see the sheriff. And when I get there, Ricky's already there, sitting in the chair with the sheriff, because he's come in through the back door where people who know the sheriff or who have worked for the sheriff, or I guess people that are close to the sheriff or employees, can come in. So I am a nervous wreck. I'm sitting there, not because I've done anything wrong. I'm sitting there about to hand something to law enforcement that I know is going to probably put somebody in jail. Something's really bad wrong here. So when I gave this to the sheriff, I told him, I said, I am not accusing anyone of anything, but there are 6 checks written here for almost $5 million, and there are no invoices and there's no purchase orders, and they're large amounts, and they've not been approved as far as I know by anyone. Here it is. So at that moment, Ricky had a backpack by his feet, and he, oh, by the way, and he pulls it up and he said, I've got $30,000 in this backpack that Michael White asked me to hold for him. So I've never heard about the $30,000. Ricky's never mentioned it before, but suddenly, because I'm going to the sheriff, Ricky's got a backpack with $30,000 he wants to turn in. So the sheriff looks at me after he looks at the sheet of paper. He asked me a few questions. I don't remember exactly what they all were. They were just sort of, you know, how did you get this? What made you look for this? I told him the story about going to James, all the deal. And then he said, could you go get me these 6 checks, copies of them, back and front, and bring them back this afternoon? I said, yeah, I can do that. I'd be glad to do that. So I left the sheriff's office. Ricky stayed. I left. And I went to the accountant. Her first name's Beverly. I'll just leave it at that. And I went to see Beverly. And I told her, I said, Beverly, I need copies of these 6 checks back and front, if you don't mind getting that for me. And I also need you not to tell anyone. The sheriff asked me not to tell anyone what I was asking for. So if you could do that for me, I would really appreciate it. Well, she did it, got me the copies, took that back to the sheriff. And so then the sheriff asked me, can you get me copies of all the invoices and all the purchase orders that go with these checks? Can you get that for me? And I said, yes, sir, I will. So I go back to City Hall. I go to Vicki Gaynor, and again, at this point, I have no reason to suspect anything from her. And I said, Vicki, I need to ask you to make copies for me for all of ECS's invoices, purchase orders, anything you have on their finances. And I need it as soon as possible. And I can't tell you why, but I'll tell you when I can. And so she had it done in like an hour. So when she called me, I also get a call from Ricky Ramey. And Ricky Ramey tells me, he said, Mayor, you know, all this stacks of stuff, he knew that the sheriff had asked for it, okay? He said, I don't want you going to the sheriff's office carrying in all these stacks of papers for people to see you as the mayor going in. Might put you in some precarious situation. So I'll meet you at Walmart parking lot and I will carry them for you. That did not sound strange to me. Right now, it sounds very strange to me. But it sounded to me like the Ricky Ramey who had protected me through the storm, who had stood by my side and told everybody this is my mayor, sounded perfectly all right to me. Ricky's going to carry all this in so nobody sees me taking it in and they don't know that I'm the snitch, okay? So I meet him in the parking lot. The sheriff had also asked me to go to our financial consultant and see if he would give me everything he had on ECS. That would be Jay Moody's accounting office. And so I had gone to Jay's office, and I went in, and when I told Jay what I wanted, his expression was like, oh, you know, when he saw what I had, but he immediately agreed to take care of it. And so I sat there while they made the copies, and Ricky sat there as well. Ricky put everything in his car and said he would take it to the sheriff's office. So I'm thinking that I am part of this, that I've done what I was supposed to do as mayor, and that the sheriff has the materials he's asked for, and that he's going to take care of it. There is probably no person with law enforcement that I trusted more at that point besides Ricky than Sheriff Tommy Ford. Nothing but a great reputation. He had been very supportive of me, very complimentary of me as mayor, told me what a good job I was doing. The only ill words we had had was on the 30th of October when I undeclared the emergency in Lynn Haven and we went back to normal business. He called and was upset and said, well, what about the curfew? Because if Lynn Haven lifts their curfew, that's going to upset things. And so I said, oh, I'll just tell the city manager that we'll keep the curfew, no problem. So that's the only disagreement we had had about anything. So I thought he supported me. I thought he admired me. I thought he trusted me. I certainly felt that way about him. He called me the next day after having looked at all of this, and he said, Mayor, there is a problem here and I'm going to call in the FBI, at which point I just took a deep breath. You know, I was just like, oh my goodness, this is really serious. And then this next part, when I think of it now, it just gives me such chills. I would give anything in this world if I had called a press conference, if I'd called an emergency commission meeting, if I'd called the whole town and said, look what I found in Lynn Haven. I just want you all to know. But the sheriff made me feel as though I was part of what was happening.
That you would compromise some investigation.
Yes, that if I talked about it,
Yeah.
that it would mess up what they were doing. He said,
Yeah.
I'm calling in the FBI and we're going to start this investigation and you cannot tell anyone. Don't tell anyone. And so I didn't. And so on April 4th, and the reason I know all these dates is because now through discovery with James and I having been through all we've been through, we have all the sheriff's reports, we have all the warrants, we have all of this with dates and times, which we can prove everything that I'm saying, and we will in civil court. They started questioning everybody in the city but me. They questioned every department head. Vicki Gaynor became their chief witness. In fact, Vicki Gaynor told me that she couldn't talk to me about the case at all because she was the witness and she was the one who was going to be coordinating with Agent Borghini, the FBI agent. She was now the witness. So the mayor of the city and this interim city manager, she's not talking to me anymore, you know, and so I'm thinking, oh, I wonder why I was really one of the smartest people in my class in school. But it still hasn't all fit together for me at that point in time. Then on April the 12th, they would raid, and many people think it was an FBI raid on ECS, Erosion Control Services, Mickey's company. It was Bay County Sheriff's Office warrant on that company. And this is where I'm probably going to tell it before, but this is probably the most important part of my story, so I want to make sure I have plenty of time to tell this part. This is where they got me. This is where they threw a net and got me for something I did not do. At some point after the hurricane, let me back up. On April 12th, when they did the raid, false invoices were planted at ECS. They were crumpled up and photographed on top of a trash can. There was a notebook opened at ECS to that $224,000 check I had approved. They took a picture of that. Anything that had, all the checks that had been written to ECS had my stamped signature, not my written signature, only that one that I approved that I told you about. Everything else was a facsimile. But they were false invoices saying that I had had my property cleaned by request by ECS in exchange for entering into the conspiracy with ECS. This property cleanup was my reward. And they billed the city of Lynn Haven $48,000 and said they cleaned my property, my mother's property, and my cousin Lena's property, but they didn't bring her into it until later. They got the addresses mixed up. They fixed that later. But anyway, those invoices were false. So now let me back up to the whole property cleanup thing, and then we'll come back to this. After the storm, my property, which is no longer my property, but where I used to live at 513 Tennessee Avenue, after all this happened, we had it surveyed again, and we actually walked all of it. There's less than 500 square feet of grass on my property. There are no trees, and everything else is a pole barn and a house and a driveway. So There were no trees on my property. There were no trees on my mother's property next door. And then the other piece of property is east of my property on Virginia Avenue, 415, Virginia. So the weekend after the storm, when my son-in-law came from Jacksonville with his friends, one of who is a big contractor in Jacksonville, and even brought equipment with him, like a little front loader. He brought a 500-gallon tank of water for my husband and I to hook onto our motorhome. This is my family, my friends, who also brought the first truck of supplies to Lynn Haven. So they cut the trees off my pole barn. They cut the trees in front of my pole barn, which are on the city right-of-way. They tarped my house. They tarped my mother's house. They cleaned all the sheetrock out of my mother's house, which had extensive damage, drug it all out to the road. They cut the tree off my mother's house that had fallen from my cousin's house at 507 and left the tree lying there, but they pushed it off so they could tarp her roof. So my family cleaned and repaired our homes and our property. All of it. Not the city, not ECS. I had requested that Michael White come and clean the trees that were still on the right-of-way. The pole barn at my house, I'm going to tell you a little secret, encroaches 7 inches on the city right-of-way. So anything, I didn't know that either until they surveyed it. But in front of my pole barn is city right-of-way. So the trees that were on that right-of-way were on city property. But my family moved that and stacked it to the side. Michael White texted Mickey White on the 9th of November, a month after the storm, a text that said, "You at the mayor's yet?" What I had asked Michael White to do was to come and get the rest of the debris that my family had cleaned up and pushed over. There was a cracked power pole. The entire street could not get power on Tennessee where I lived until that pole was fixed. Well, luckily for me, the power company came out on October the 29th, either the 19th or 29th. I have the video and it's date stamped. And they put up a new power pole around all the old trash that the city still hadn't moved. And for some reason, I was just awe-stricken by that, and I was out there videoing it while they were out there, and it's date stamped. And you can see all in the background those cut trees that my family had cleaned, that the property did not have all this debris, and it was clean. This would all prove later that it was all a big lie. So let me back up just a little bit more on this whole property issue. First of all, there is an easement, there's a ditch that runs from 5th to 6th Street between Virginia and Tennessee Avenue. I used to swim in it when I was a little girl. You can't swim in it anymore because it's not that big of a ditch, and part of it's piped. There is an easement on the property east of mine. The easement belongs to that property. Okay. So even if the easement was declared not an easement and they cleaned it, it still was not my property. It was on 415 Virginia Avenue, and that's what we proved.
Judge Walker said that as well.
So the part of it that is the most irritating to me, that makes me the craziest when I think about it, is that during the Sheriff's Department's investigation, Investigator Jimmy Stanford, Investigator Jeremy Mathis, who were the two who did most of the questioning through this, they questioned every neighbor of mine. They questioned the city employees. They questioned all of the ECS people who cleaned back in the area of the property, some of whom they went as far as to Tennessee, where those people were in jail, to get their testimony. Did you clean the mayor's property? Well, they don't know if they cleaned my property or what property they cleaned, but they got all these testimonies. They never questioned me. They never came to me and said, "Mayor, you've been accused of having your property cleaned and billed to the city. What do you have to say to that?" Wouldn't you think that would be a protocol of a sheriff's department, if they are investigating someone for a crime, to come and ask the person they're investigating their side of the story? They had virtually no curiosity. The sheriff's department did not want to know anything about my property from me. So just to reiterate one more time, there were no trees on my property. There were no trees on my mother's property. There was one tree on my cousin's property from 507, which had fallen. So I want to just backtrack for one more minute. There was a contractor living at 507 in the property owned by my cousin, who she had made a deal with you can live in the house there, which is a rental house and no one's in it, while you're here doing cleanup in Lynn Haven, if you'll clean up my property. And he did. And we had a picture of him, his driver's license, his contact information, which we turned over and used as our evidence, which they completely ignored. My mother paid him $1,500 to finish removing the tree that had fallen from my cousin's property onto her property. And everything else at my mother's house was done by my son-in-law and his friends. My mother was devastated when the indictment was read that said she received free cleanup from the city. She is so well loved and well known in Lynn Haven. She's lived here. She married my dad when she was very young. For her to be dragged through the mud like that her property was cleaned by the city and then billed. But now I want to back up and show you even how much darker that this got. Derwin White gave these invoices that were produced that it shows ECS billed the city.
2 weeks after you blew the whistle.
Yes, yes. 2 weeks after I went to Tommy Ford, on April the 12th, a little less than 2 weeks, when they raided this building. In Mickey White's testimony, he says that Derwin White came to him and said, "Do you have any invoices that show that you cleaned the mayor's property?" And he said, "No." And he said, "Well, you need to get some." So there's another testimony from the woman who worked for Mickey White who said that she came to him and told her what to do. She made the invoices. And then when she made them, he said, "No, these aren't going to work. You're going to have to put a different date," because she had dated them for March, right then. And so she went back and backdated them to November. So then Derwin is circulating these. And I say Derwin because he's behind it. He's mad. I have my personal belief that Arthur Cullen was involved because the newspaper and the news media got it. And I will challenge Arthur Cullen to a lie detector test over who's telling the truth and who's not, as well as Mathis and Stanford and Ford and all of them.
These are all the investigators at the sheriff's office. And again, I want to reiterate, Arthur Cullen is the campaign manager right now for Sheriff Tommy Ford.
So I lost that train of thought a little bit there.
About the invoices.
So the invoices magically made their way to Channel 13. After I went to the sheriff on April the 1st, I began to be afraid because I found a fish lying on the doorstep, kind of like the old Godfather thing, Sleep with the Fishes. And I called Ricky Ramey and told him, and he laughed at me and told me that I was imagining things, that it probably washed up there or someone threw it there. And I said, well, we haven't had any heavy rains or floods, but the fish was lying there. So my husband said, why don't we take the motorhome out to the beach for a few days, and just, because my house, if you know where I lived, was very accessible to anyone. And I wanted it that way before the storm, but not so much after I'd been to the sheriff and I knew that they knew I'd been. So we went out to venture out at the beach, and we were out there for a few days. And on April 24th, which just happens to be the second raid that they made, Channel 13's Brady Calhoun called me and said, Mayor Anderson, I've got 3 invoices that say that you had your property cleaned by the city and that you charged it to the city. And I wonder if you have a statement to make. And I was like, what? What? And also, just backtracking just for a second, there were several people who testified on Facebook. This is where they got their testimony, and they went and asked questions, that they saw ECS at my house cleaning up my mother's house and my house the day after the storm, that weekend. Well, guess what? That's when my family was there cleaning. And according to the text messages, even if it had been true that they were cleaning my house, it was November the 9th. It wasn't October the 14th and 15th. That's when my family was there. And the contractor who was over there helping my family, who came from Jacksonville, his company actually wears orange T-shirts. And I have the picture with his logo, which we showed to the judge in the court in the evidentiary hearing. So I went to the TV station, and I knew that the property that they were talking about, because they did come on the 9th of November, and they did clear that stuff away as I had asked. But it wasn't my property. And I actually, up to that point, I'm still not knowing these are fake invoices. I'm still thinking this is a mistake. They're just referencing it as the mayor's property. Are you at the mayor's? Because it's behind my house. It's on the east side of my house, the mayor's house. So I'm still not thinking I'm in any trouble here. Okay, I'm still pretty innocent about this whole thing. And so when I get to the TV station, I asked to speak to Tom Lewis and Terry Cole, the station manager. And I went in and I said, what? And they showed me these invoices. And I said, this is a mistake. I mean, they may have cleaned this easement behind my house. And I told Tom Lewis, I said, pull up Google Earth. I'm going to put my dog down. I said, pull up Google Earth after, before the hurricane and after. And he did. He pulled it up and he looked. And I said, do you see any trees in my yard? Nobody cleaned my yard. My yard didn't have any trees, just some leaves and stuff in it. And I said, this is not true. I said, somebody's made a mistake. Tom Lewis looked me in the eye and he said, this is a non-story. He couldn't see. I mean, he said, there's no story here. He said, there's nothing that's been cleaned from her property. Terry Cole looked me in the eye and he said, he said, you're probably the best loved mayor in this town. He said, I think about you. And I'm just telling you what he said. He said, I think about you like Princess Diana. You're kind of the people's princess right now. People think you're doing such a great job. And he said, but you've got some real enemies. You've got some real enemies. So I'm assuming that he's talking about whoever brought him these invoices down there.